Hey folks, how's it going? Matt Ryder. It is day 25, April 25th of National Poetry Month 2020. Trying a different format. This camera wasn't working for a little while, so I'm giving it a shot again. Gives me a little bit more freedom and hopefully won't take up much time on my phone. Now that I explained my new surroundings. Gonna read two poets for you today. And I was just thinking, I've been writing a lot and thinking about how I've been doing this series this month and not really giving background on much of the poems. And I want you guys to know that that's purposeful. My engagement with poetry started through poems, not the poet, not the history behind the poems, not the era they came from or the particular historical period or anything. My first engagement with poetry was pretty much the words, albeit it was the words of Jim Morrison and Bob Dylan and Kurt Cobain. But these were the people that introduced me to paying attention to the words and not the person that was writing them. And made mistakes along the way, namely Jim Morrison. But no, just kidding. The point I'm trying to make is that we don't always need to have background behind the poem to appreciate the poem. And I think the poems actually I'm going to read today by two amazing poets are poems that somehow find their way into your current situation. And I think that a great poem doesn't highlight the situation that the poet is in at that given time, even though that is important to the poet. And that would never take away from the intention of the poem. But one of the things that I learned about poetry, that it is pretty much a 50-50 deal. The poet puts out 50% of the work, and you as the reader have to do 50% of the work yourself. So the poem's meanings, regardless of their background, regardless of the truth to the story, or the intention of the poet, the poems have their own rendering for you. They come up in your mind as a situation that you could see, and it's entirely created by them, the poet, but it's in a situation unto yourself that you could see. And that's what I've always loved about poetry. So the two poets I'm going to read today are remarkably, strikingly are basically on the mark when it comes to our current situation, and maybe not the first one as much as the second, but the first poet I'm going to read is Cole Swenson, and the book is called Ghost, and it's just the first section of her book. And again, I have a thing for short poems. I have a thing for small units of poetry. You're really not going to see me, reading the Odyssey here. For a couple of hours. I try to do 10-15 minutes of poetry, and I think that's, for most people, that's more than enough. But when it comes to poems like this, they're short, they're little, and I think they capture a moment. So I'm just going to read the first section of this book that Cole wrote back in 2004, I believe, 2005, somewhere around then. And I met her a couple years back, really wonderful conversations, reacquainted with her recently at Martin Corliss Smith's reading at Tony Torrance Place in the city, and just had another wonderful conversation with her as well. So this is from the first section of her book called Off-White. The epigraph that starts the book says, "Life is not a personal thing," by Gilles Deleuze. Gilles Deleuze, I'm not sure how to say his name, but life is not a personal thing. I think that's a great way to start it. Showing that kind of like, poems are not really that personal. They become yours, whether the situation is yours or somebody else's. Hope this is recording okay, but I'm going to assume it is. I'm already 5 minutes into it and I haven't read a poem yet. Sorry about that. All right. The Girl Who Never Rained. Oddly enough, there was always a city block of clear weather on every side of her. A space just large enough that the casual passerby simply thought, what an odd spot of calm. And often people who knew her well never quite put it together, as, after all, it's not that usual to have a break in the storm, though they'd develop, and after a while, an odd inclination to be with her without really thinking out why. Other than that, her life was neither better nor worse than most, except, of course, the crowds. I'm reading these poems. Just opened the book yesterday and hadn't opened the book in a while. They're about city and distance and space and proximity and really what we're thinking about right now. Not just social distancing, but mental distancing. Others. You walk into a house in which several people are sitting in the dark around a dinner table, eating, drinking, laughing. Every night on the answering machine, there is among the others one blank call, at least 30 seconds of nothing. And if ever stopped, you'd have to start calling up and leaving it for someone else. Well, maybe that sets it in a certain time because it's the answering machine. But it doesn't. That's the only thing that places this poem in a certain time frame. There's a set of identical twins who communicate through prime numbers, and certain figures in medieval paintings whose extra fingers can only be seen at a glance. Once there was a man who wrote a symphony based entirely on the arrangement of birds on the power lines outside. It's called somnifying. To psalmizate is the infinite, transitive, to sing any object into place. Psalmizate. In the crowded subway, a stranger stands behind you with one hand warmly on the small of your back. Niepce's first photograph, which was the first photograph, was of a scene of roofs so blurred they were often mistaken for snails. Of people passing on the other side of frosted glass. A woman at the opera is talking in her sleep. Once there was a man who sang in his sleep. 4 out of 5 living things are insects. Just wonderful little poems. I want to read more, but I'll let you do that. Go out there and check out Cole Swenson's poems. Beautiful work that she writes. Hi, Cole. It's a beautiful day out finally. The sun's coming out. I can hear birds. It's sunny out. It's supposed to be like almost 60 today, which is odd for it to be so late in April, and it's going to hit 60 degrees in Jersey City. But it's nice out there, but we have to be cautious still. So I guess the next set of poems are going to be cautionary tales of and by no means is it the poet's intention. I don't think that COVID wasn't going on when he wrote these poems, but thinking about distance and space, and even though we're hearing about lightening up of stay-at-home orders and stay-in-place orders, folks, we're not ready to do it, and so. Please stay in place, and if you go out, especially if you go out running, because I know a lot of you folks run and bike, just cover your mouths. You're running. The hot air and everything is just flying everywhere, and particulates and COVID, whether you know you have it or not. Sorry, little rant on runners. My apologies to runners. Just keep your mouth covered. Anyway, I'm going to read a couple poems from, Amish Trivedi. Who I got to meet a couple years back. Did a reading with him in Brooklyn, where I met him, and we hit it off and loved his poems. Again, nice short poems in this collection called "Your Relationship to Motion Has Changed." I think our relationship to the world has changed. And Amish actually kind of hits the nail right on the head with some of those. So I'm going to read a couple of these poems briefly for you. I'm sorry, I'm sitting in a rocking chair. And I don't think Amish is on Facebook anymore. I think he's taking a leave of absence from Facebook, which is probably a good idea. Or if he's on here, hey Amish. Okay, America. One more nightmare and I'm out. I seem to remember you dancing while holding your arm bent back and tensing. Another dream of child rearing, and another about falling down into the gravel and being picked up, only to be dropped again. I've said this before, and I've said this before. Actually, I screwed that up. The last line is, I've said this before, and I've said it before. Remember that poem's titled America. Breathing. The grass I know is melting, and plastic, and another thing. I've stopped believing in parchment that was dwindling and brittle. I popped my lungs out and back in. This breathing is tense, and I don't remember why we're crying in the first place. And I'll say it before this next sharp intake. Breathing. And as I'm reading through, I'm like, that might be the COVID poem. That might be the COVID poem. That might be the COVID poem. And I'll say it before this next sharp intake. Okay, sorry. This is what I love about poetry. I don't know what Amish's intention was behind these poems. I don't even care. No offense, love you, Amish. The poem, when it leaves the poet, becomes the audience's, and the audience makes it what it is. And again, if you're watching this and you're in my creative writing class, a lot of students are asking, do I put notes down explaining situations? Do I put things here that explain what's going on in the poem? And my first impulse is no. Let the poet, let the reader do the research. One of the, I hate to say it, but one of the wonderful tools that the poet has now, or the reader has now, is the internet. They could look up all references like that. You know, when I was starting out when I started in college in 1994, the internet was, there was some good literary sources on there, but it was two things. It was literature and porn, and that was what the internet started as. So you got really two things out of it. One of them was worthwhile, and one of them wasn't. Anyway, going back to what I was just saying, the poems that the references in the poems and stuff like that I was talking about earlier in this conversation, in this taping, in this filming, whatever you want to call it, in this series, it doesn't matter. The meaning behind the poem, everyone's like, oh, I don't understand what it means. What do you think it means? What does it mean to you? That's the first place to start. Everything else will fall in after that. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to read this as the last poem. Which poem was it? Oh yeah, final poem for the day. Once again, wash your hands and keep your distance. I'll meet you on that other shore. Leaving the house when I'm not meeting anyone allows me to be a wanderer and not a tourist. These streets, which were once covered in feet, are now silent and aching to hear more. Everyone is always headed somewhere. But I go out of my way to make sure I don't appear. To follow is to have no sense of your own, just a desire not to be lost. But when one gives up desire, then one can see all distances together. I don't really know what else to say besides that. Thank you, Amish Trivedi. Your relationship to motion has changed. My only hope is, and I know there's very few people watching this, but my hope by the end of this month is that your relationship to poetry has changed. Take care, wash your hands, and tell somebody that you love them. Take care, folks.